Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has shot back after criticism from Donald Trump. The US president earlier blamed Ukraine's president for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Zelenskyy said Trump has been influenced by Russian disinformation.
President Trump is someone who we respect a lot as a leader of the nation that we really respect, the American nation, who supported us all the time. Unfortunately, he lives in a disinformation space.
US President Donald Trump has lashed out at the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. That is after Zelenskyy complained about not being included in talks between the US and Russia about Ukraine's future. Trump appeared to blame Zelenskyy for Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Let's take a listen.
I think I have the power to end this war, and I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. But they chose not to do it that way. And President Biden, in all fairness, he doesn't have a clue. What he was so bad for this. He was so bad, so pathetic, so sad.
Hours after those incendiary comments, US Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Kellogg, arrived in Kyiv. He will have talks with President Zelenskyy and military commanders later today. Kellogg told reporters that the US understood Ukraine's concerns.
We understand the need for security guarantees. It's very clear to us the importance of the sovereignty of this nation, the independence of this nation as well.
All right, let's get more on all of this from our Riga Bureau Chief Yuri Rushetto. Yuri's been based in Riga since DW was banned from reporting from Russia. And we have our correspondent Nick Connolly standing by in Kyiv. Hello to both of you. Nick, can we start by talking about President Trump's remarks in which he seemed to blame Ukraine for Russia's aggression, despite the clear fact that it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. So how are people in Ukraine reacting to this?
I think there's a lot of head scratching here in Kyiv today. I think people weren't expecting it that clearly from Donald Trump, even though there had been a fair bit of talk about the fact that this is a man who basically, in terms of values, doesn't see an intrinsic problem with taking other people's territory, right? This is a president who's talking about annexing Canada, or Canada becoming the 51st state, Panama, Greenland, all kinds of territories around the world needing to basically come under US control. So there's nothing on a kind of values level that really seems that egregious to him in what Russia has done here in Ukraine. But there is just lots of kind of incredulity about why it seems, from a Ukrainian perspective, that Donald Trump, if he's going to make such a great deal and get such a great deal from Putin, why is he giving up all these things to Russia right now before even anyone has properly got down to negotiations around a table?
And President Zelenskyy, I believe, just held a press conference in the last moments where he responded to Trump's comments.
Well, the thing that particularly seemed to pique him was Trump's comment about 4% approval ratings for Zelenskyy. That seems to have been kind of taken up as a kind of personal dig, and he pushed back on that and said that there needed to be more truth in what was coming from the Trump team. He also said that they seem to have been pretty quick to take up Russian talking points, so that they should be more critical about that. It does really seem like a change in gear. The first couple of days, especially after that first Trump call to Putin, it seemed like the Ukrainians were biting their tongues, and as much as they didn't like lots of the stuff they were hearing, they were trying to keep on the right side of Trump and keep quiet. They obviously have decided that that's not working, so they are coming out a lot more forcefully now.
So what can we expect from today with the US Ukraine envoy Kellogg in Kyiv for talks with President Zelenskyy? What's likely to come out of that meeting?
I don't think we're going to find out too much in public today. It seems like Trump has basically split his teams into two, right? So you've got Kellogg, who's responsible for Ukraine, and then there's another person, Witkoff, who's in charge of the negotiations with Russia, amongst other people. So it's not the same person going between the two sides. He talked about the need to listen today. He also mentioned that he understood that Ukraine needed security guarantees. How they would look, what America's contribution to that would be, is all unclear. But certainly the fact that he is finally here is seen as a plus. But I don't think we're going to get the big news now. I think the bigger question is when Zelenskyy will actually get that face-to-face with, when or if even, that face-to-face with Donald Trump. That is certainly something the Ukrainian side is very keen to secure.
US officials have been talking openly about the need for concessions from both sides for a peace deal to be made. Yuri, tell us, what could those concessions be for Russia?
Well, Anya, that's a $1 million question, I would say. At the moment, we are constantly talking about possible territorial concessions by Ukraine, about possible presidential elections in Ukraine, but not about concessions by the Russians, because they are in a position of strength, both militarily, thanks to territorial gains in Donbass, and diplomatically, thanks to Donald Trump. What's more, there are reports that US intelligence believes that Putin is not interested in a real peace agreement on Ukraine at all. It's said that Putin thinks he is winning and hopes to wait for the moment when he will be able to take control to the entire Ukraine. So there is speculation that Putin could hold talks, but only to see what he can get as concessions.
Nick, Zelenskyy has said that he, or rather he did say he was going to travel to Saudi Arabia after the US-Russia talks were hosted there. Then he cancelled. Just talk to us again about his sense of frustration about the fact that he's being excluded from those talks.
Just before I get to that, Anya, I just want to say that what you're hearing behind me is an air raid siren, which for now I've been told it's all okay, we can carry on. But it is unusual, because normally when these big American, rather international visits come, there seems to be kind of back channels diplomacy with the Russians to avoid any attacks that could threaten Kyiv while the people are in town. So it is unusual that seemingly that is still going on right now. As for the whole Saudi story, yep, that definitely seems to have gone down very badly, as we understand the Ukrainian side saying that they had a pre-existing visit to Saudi planned before the US-Russian bilateral trip was planned. Zelenskyy was in the UAE just before, but he obviously decided he didn't want to be in town and not meeting Marco Rubio and being obviously excluded, so he decided to head straight to Turkey and avoid Saudi for now. We've heard from an unnamed source for now that the Saudis wanted to include the Ukrainians in these talks, and obviously seemingly the Americans were fine with them not being there. I think there's just a real trauma here of Ukraine being basically just the object of negotiations between bigger countries. We know that Vladimir Putin wants to do a kind of bilateral grand deal with the Americans and get them out of Europe and basically have the kind of permission from America to do what he wants in Europe. So they are going to play hardball now and make as much noise as they can to make sure that they are at that table.
And Russia has been very clear about the fact that the idea of NATO peacekeepers in Ukraine is unacceptable. Yuri, do you see them accepting any kind of security guarantees for Ukraine?
Well, Foreign Minister Lavrov spoke of unacceptable European soldiers who would automatically be NATO soldiers in most European armies. Perhaps he was indicating that soldiers from non-NATO countries might be acceptable for him or for Russia as peacekeepers after all. The Russians could suggest their Belarusian allies based on the motto, you want your allies, we want ours. Or it could be soldiers from the Asian countries or South American countries. It's difficult to say because Russia is constantly demanding security guarantees for itself. First and foremost, the ban on Ukraine joining NATO.
And Yuri, from what we've seen in recent days, it's clear, that the idea of Russia being internationally isolated, this is now over for Vladimir Putin. He's back on the stage. How is this being portrayed by the Russian media?
Well, look, of course, the Russian state-financed media are celebrating the end of Russia's isolation in the Western world, or at least in terms of the United States. And they are celebrating their President Putin as someone who has achieved one of his, let's say, most important goals, namely to negotiate directly with Americans without Ukraine. Let me remind you, in December 2021, just 2 months before the war started, Moscow sent its demands for security guarantees to Washington. One of them was a direct dialogue, negotiation directly with the USA without Ukraine. That goal Putin seems to have achieved in Saudi Arabia yesterday with his Foreign Minister Lavrov.
And Nick, just one last question to you. You mentioned it earlier, Donald Trump saying Ukraine should have elections. The Kremlin says the same. What do Ukrainians think?
I think it just doesn't fly from a Ukrainian's perspective. And even Zelensky's most kind of vocal political opponents are not pushing for elections, let alone wider society. People are very conscious of the fact that, firstly, logistically, it's going to be pretty much impossible to carry out elections because so many people are outside the country, so many people are in uniform on the front lines. Secondly, Ukraine's constitution simply doesn't allow it. We are in a state of war, so that is all off the cards, and that is something that Parliament has voted for, that state of emergency, so that is not something that's legally possible. But also broadly, why is Russia pushing for this? Because they want Ukraine and its kind of social unity that's held more or less since this invasion began to falter. They want internal debates, internal conflicts to distract Ukraine and its army from the front lines. And I think people are very conscious of why it is that Russia is demanding this. It's not for the sake of democracy. It is to weaken Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Nick Connolly reporting from Kyiv and Yuri Reshetto in Riga. Thank you so much to both of you. And we can welcome now Maria Avdeeva, who is a Ukrainian security analyst and Eurasia Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. That's a US think tank. Welcome to DW, Maria. Thank you for your time today. Ukraine is insisting, as we've been hearing, that it must be at the table for any peace talks. We've heard Donald Trump in the last 24 hours saying, and I'm quoting here, "You've been there for 3 years. You should never have started it. You could have made a deal." So we're seeing Trump seemingly blaming Zelenskyy for Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Can I ask you, first of all, your reaction to those comments?
Well, people in Ukraine are shocked, to say the least, and the allies that was with Ukraine from the very start of the Russian invasion, meaning the US, that was supplying Ukraine with all kinds of military help, now is blaming Ukrainians for not putting down the weapons and for holding back Russian invasion for all the 3 years. This is something that Ukrainians cannot accept, and people in Ukraine cannot accept Russia being not called the aggressor, but being portrayed as a victim. But what is important as this, hearing this and not taking this, Ukrainians are ready to continue fighting. And President Zelenskyy has said that, yes, Ukraine will not be able to win militarily in the war against Russia without the help of the US. But Ukrainians will not abandon our land, and Ukrainians will continue fighting, and we will not let Russia occupy our territory. And this is what's happening along the front line. While everyone is watching the top negotiations, Russia is currently very heavily attacking all along the front line. And these are Ukrainian soldiers that are still there, that are holding the front lines, and they are fighting back the Russian invasion.
But does Ukraine have any other choice but to do what Washington says, given that the US has been one of its major backer?
Well, European Union basically has to step up and continue supporting Ukraine, especially militarily. Europe had 3 years to prepare for this, and it was kind of obvious before Trump was elected that this moment is coming, and Europe is the largest ally for Ukraine, especially in terms of military equipment. And this is also important because if Ukraine fails and if Putin succeeds here, European countries, NATO member states like Baltic states and Poland will be the next targets for Russia. And this is also very obvious. So Putin is not going just to stay where he is. He will go further. And this is in the interest of all European countries to support Ukraine so that their soldiers will not have to fight with the Russians afterwards.
Mm-hmm. The French president is having another round of talks with both EU and non-European partners today. So do you see these talks as being critical for Ukraine's future?
Well, critical for Ukraine is to hear what will be the security guarantees. And this is something we haven't heard from Trump administration. And this is what we don't hear yet from France or from our other allies. Because, yes, there were talks that there will be some soldiers from some international troops on Ukrainian soil. But if you look at the map and if you look how long and huge the front line is, the numbers we have heard are very much non-sufficient to keep the Russia from attacking further. So Ukraine needs a very hard, secure guarantees that will not allow Russia to attack Ukraine again, and that will not allow Russia to, prepare, develop more capabilities and attack in some time. But this, the next time, they will go further than Ukraine. And this is what needs to be worked out together between European countries and together with Ukraine, because Ukraine wants Europeans to be at the table of negotiations. Ukraine does not want to be excluded from the talks, and Ukraine wants Europe to be a part of these talks.
I wanted to ask you also about what we've heard from Donald Trump, pushing Zelenskyy to hold elections. I believe the Ukrainian constitution prohibits elections during martial law, which the country has been under since Russia's full-scale invasion 3 years ago. How vulnerable would you say that Ukraine's leadership is right now, including President Zelenskyy?
President Zelenskyy still has a very high level of support among Ukrainians. And what is interesting, especially now, since we started hearing all these remarks coming from President Trump, and after the talks in Saudi Arabia, Ukrainians are saying now is the time when we have to be united together and support our president, no matter what is your political preferences, because this is a time which Ukrainians now compare to what happened when Russia invaded. They say this is almost like that. The level of unpredictability and the level of threat is so high that Ukrainians say we have now to be united as a nation, and we have to be united together and support our leader, which is President Zelenskyy. And after we finish with the war, after we have peace, then we will have elections, because this is the only possibility to have free and fair elections. Otherwise, Russia will be applauding, because they have all these people on occupied territories that cannot vote. Millions of Ukrainians are abroad. Lots of them, millions, are in Germany. And these are all people that want to have their vote counted. And this is what we cannot do while the war is still ongoing.
A quick last question about the suggestions that Trump and Putin might meet as early as this month. How do Ukrainians see that moment, as Trump is essentially upending years of US policy on Russia?
Well, President Putin will come out of isolation. In this case, he already is coming out of isolation after the phone call, but this will be, much more much bigger sign, and this will actually appease other countries, other autocracies to use blackmail to go and invade neighboring countries, to grab other territories, because they will know that now the architecture in the world, the security architecture, is completely different, and now only the strong countries which have nuclear power or which have weapons of mass destruction can decide. And this is not the world we, like in Europe, have been building after the World War II. And this is not the world where Ukrainians want to live. And this is why we will oppose to this, and hope that at the end, Europe, Ukraine will have the word and will decide on their future, not Putin, who is the aggressor and who is the invader.
Maria Avdieva from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Maria, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.